Okay, kind of let everybody filter in here, get their audio set up. Great. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the How Good Innovation Online series. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to our next hour of discussion. As a way of introducing one another, if audience members would like to put their name and where they're based into the chat, you can also put your role and your company if you want to. That way we can get to know each other a little bit, even though we're not going to have the chance to introduce ourselves to one another. My name is Leah Wolfe. I am currently in Los Angeles, California. I am the head of regenerative education and content here at How Good, and I am so excited to be speaking with our two panelists today. We have joining us Claire Oliverson, who is the head of marketing at Too Good To Go, and Maddie Rotman, who is the head of sustainability at Imperfect Foods. So today we're going to be talking about ways that organizations and procurement and sourcing teams can help to reduce food waste throughout the supply system. So just to run through a quick agenda for our time together today, we will finish up our introduction. We will have a 40 to 45-minute conversation with our thought leaders. And finally, we'll open it up for a Q&A with the speakers before we wrap up at the top of the hour. So even though there's that time toward the end that's sort of designated as Q&A, as we continue through our discussion today, I'd like to invite the audience to put any questions that they might have into the chat, and I will do my best to get to them and relay them to the panel. And lastly, I hope that you can join us on April 14th. We'll be talking with Felipe Villela, who is the founder and COO of Renature, and Gael Legallard, who is the design manager at Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And we're going to be talking about the role that procurement can and should play in a circular economy. So you can sign up for that on our website, howgood.com/innovation-series. I will put that into the chat so that you guys can go there and do that. Great. So I'm going to stop my slide share here. And so now I'd like to give the panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves. Let's just do a quick introduction, a little bit about you, a little bit about what your organization does, and kind of a bit about your sustainability journey. So what brought you to work in sustainability and work specifically in sustainability at your company. Maddie, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. So I'm Maddie Rotman, head of sustainability at Imperfect Foods. Imperfect is a D2C online grocer. We started in about 2015 on a mission to sort of reimagine grocery delivery and to eliminate food waste as a concept. So what we do is we partner with producers and growers at the farm and in the supply chain and actually bring products to market that would have been wasted. And things that you can imagine are tiny apples, really large potatoes, and everything from broken pretzel pieces along the supply chain. And so we have an online grocery platform where people can shop for the groceries every week and then get them delivered. The way that I sort of got here is I've always been in food. And I've been in food systems, I've been in retail, and I knew how wasteful the food system was and how wasteful retail was, and wanted to work on something bigger. I sort of grew up solving problems around the table and over food, and knew that we could actually solve some really big climate problems through food. And so in working in food, I was like, how can I make a bigger difference, and how can we actually rethink this whole system? And that's how I ended up with Imperfect.
Awesome. I love the way you frame that too, about solving problems over food and around a table. If you just like think about how many problems have been solved over a meal, I think that's a wonderful way to frame that. Claire, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Hey guys. So Claire Oliverson, head of marketing at Too Good To Go. And what we do at Too Good To Go is really centered around tech for good. So our founders really took the fact that 40% of food is lost or wasted, which is extremely daunting and a bit overwhelming, and tried to come up with like a very kind of simple, positive, and easy solution to be able to rescue some of that delicious food at the food service and retail level. And so, Too Good To Go, it's a free app. You can download it for iOS or Android. And what you'll see is a little map feature in your area. We're live now in 12 cities within the US, including New York, Chicago, San Francisco. And you'll see partners on there from, supermarket chains to local mom and pop shops, who all have, some amount of surplus at the end of the day. Every business operates so that they can serve the last customer just as well as they serve the first. And so that means, extra pizza slices, extra produce, et cetera. So for me, I really came into this industry because of my love of food. I've always been in food. I actually, when I was younger, I used to work at cafes and bakeries. And it just broke my heart to throw that food away at the end of the day. A lot of the time employees can take it home. I absolutely did, that's for sure. But there's only so much that you can take home or use yourself. And so, when I saw Too Good To Go come along, we were founded in Copenhagen in 2016. We've only now been in the US for about 18 months. I was like, please bring me on, let's do this. And so our mission is really to get this solution in as many hands as possible, both for our partners and for consumers.
Awesome. So I think that a question that a lot of people in sustainability, whether that's in food or climate change mitigation or whatever sector, often get asked the question, what can I do? And I think people are really interested on a personal level, what actions they can take to make a difference. So last week, as I'm sure you're both aware, was Food Waste Action Week. And so I just want to start by asking what actions you take outside of your professional life to combat food waste. Claire, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I can totally start with this one. I'm like a bad example because I'm so over the top about it. Like, I work in this industry for a reason. I try to eat fully plant-based as much as I can from a carbon emission standpoint. But also, I love food and cooking. I actually, before I was with Too Good To Go, I was with quite a large food recipe kind of publishing TV show, magazines, cookbooks, etc. And so I really know sort of food and ingredients inside and out. And I try to use every piece of produce as much as I can. I think that's one of the first and foremost, ways that you can really cut down on food waste, is actually saying, I'm going to take these carrots, use the full carrot plus the stems themselves because they're delicious and actually pretty cool. And that goes all the way through to, pretty much every piece of produce you can get. And if you can't use it, you can always boil it up for stock, vegetable stock. I mean, there's so many good tips out there. And I would say, if you're looking for more tips, actually on our Instagram, Too Good To Go, we're always sharing stuff like this. I think Imperfect is doing something similar. We love what those guys are doing. So there's a lot of good resources out there.
Yeah, I feel similar to Claire, where I'm like, I'm not the average person to ask. Like, we're both probably too over the top. I start with fridge inventory. Like, I take it pretty seriously. I make it fun, but like knowing what's in your fridge at all times, making sure things are really visible so you can see things, whether it's like I have a leftover shelf. So like one shelf is just food that needs to get eaten, having that organization, putting things in clear containers so that it looks appetizing and that you want to go back to it. I know so much of this is psychological and visual for a lot of people. So I do a lot of fridge inventory, and whether I'm like moving things into the freezer, if I know I'm not going to eat them, if I have plans this week and I know I'm not going to be home for dinner, I'll put things in the freezer, or I'll take things out of the freezer based on what's going on in the week. So I take like the planning part pretty seriously. And then, also always have a bag in your freezer of like stems and edges that you can put for stock. Just keep it in your freezer until you're ready to actually make it. And then I'm lucky enough to actually use a composting service. So anything that can't be used, I'll make sure to compost, but lots of tips and tricks out there. The Too Good To Go Instagram is great. We have a blog called The Whole Carrot because we literally want to use the whole carrot. And so I'll often go there for a little recipe or a tip and trick if I'll search like zucchini, like I don't know what to do this week with this. And just, having fun with it, but making sure that really you're using everything just so there are, there's creative ways and it can be fun and it doesn't have to feel so daunting, and just celebrating the little ones. The little pesto you make or the little thing you freeze can be really fun along the way.
Amazing. Yeah, I think that it's really interesting just making adjustments based on human psychology. I saw something on social media that was saying you should keep your produce not in the opaque crisper drawer where you can't see it and it's hard to remember what you have in there, but like keep it in jars on a shelf, or even keep it in the door of the fridge if that works for you. So yeah, I love both of your social media presences, and I've definitely learned a lot. So I'd like to talk a little bit about regenerative. How Good is really dedicated to advancing regeneration throughout the supply system. And so I like to ask everyone whether they have regenerative explicitly in their organizational language or not, kind of what regenerative means to you personally, or, to your organization at large, if that applies. Maddie, you can take this one first.
Yeah, this is such a great question. And obviously a major supporter and fan of sort of the system and concept of regenerative. We don't have it in our explicit language, but we have it as a way of thinking. And, we've said that our external blog for customers and consumers is use the whole carrot. And it's actually one of our internal values. And one of the ways that we, think about why does Imperfect exist as a business, it's really about, okay, here's the food system. About 30% of all food waste is happening at the farm. How can we help our farmers sort of tackle that? And how can we build an ecosystem or more ecosystems for them to make sure that everything gets used? And when we sort of that's a zoom in to why we exist, this food waste, but then we zoom out and it's like, well, why is this happening? It's all about resource utilization, right? It's all about how can we respect and use all of the resources that go into growing food, producing food, moving food. And so for us, it's really about rethinking how can our food system grow, exist, evolve, sort of be nebulous, so that we respect the resources in the soil and the ground and we can give back to them. Thinking about wasting food and thinking about the wasted water and carbon and all of the greenhouse gases, that's what we want to avoid at all costs. And so how can we sort of rethink, reshape, and renew our ways of thinking, our processes, so that the entire food system really is regenerative, or really is restoring back at the soil. So while it's respecting and partnering with farmers that use these practices, or also just rethinking the whole system, we really love, Leah, that your team really thinks about regenerative thinking too. And so that's been a huge piece of growing our business and growing sort of our internal dynamics.
So cool. And before we move on to Claire, I just want to dig in a little bit to something that you said. The statistic that 30% of food waste is happening on the farm, that's something that I've definitely heard before. And I think that it sort of gets a lot of attention when people are talking about food waste. Can you talk a little bit about why that is, and like what's happening at the farm level that all this food is going to waste right off the bat?
Yeah, it's a really powerful statistics. And for anyone that's more interested, there's a lot of information about sort of the whole supply chain and where the food is getting wasted along the way. About 30% of it's at the farm. So that's even before it leaves sort of the first producer. And then the other statistic that often gets talked about, and I'm sure Claire's gonna want to talk about, is 40% sort of happening at the home. So those are the two big pieces. And then a lot's happening in the middle, right? At retailers, sort of along the whole chain. But the 30% at the farm, a lot of that's about imperfection, right? So sizing, shape, color, sort of not hitting conventional retail standards. That's a major part. And that's sort of why we exist as a business. I think additionally, a lot of it's forecasting and sort of making sure that there is the right places for this food to go, right? Sort of creating more nimble supply chains, and and then also just logistics, being in the right place at the right time. But making sure that we're sort of taking all fruits, veggies, produce that's grown based on no matter what it looks like, is sort of the core of why we exist, because we realize that's a major part of that 30% at the farm.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, Claire, I'd love to hear from you about your thoughts on regeneration. And if I'm not sure if Too Good To Go has any kind of regenerative thinking, but I'd love to hear what you've got to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we live in a time where we have to have regenerative thinking, honestly, if we're going to move into, a brighter future. For us, we don't work at the farm level. We really work with partners who are in food service and retail. So, again, kind of like that local deli, the supermarket, even sort of high-end restaurants, anyone who is selling food on a day-to-day basis. So I think we really think about regeneration as kind of renewing and restoring the way that we value our food and the way that we consume our food. And so, when Maddie was talking earlier about the three big areas where food gets lost or wasted, there's the supply chain farm level, there's that, household level, but we really focus on that kind of in between. And there's a ton of food that actually does get wasted there. And I think it's this really, I'd say sort of similar to the farm level, it's this really kind of quiet issue that no one talks about. It's really not a part of our cultural consciousness to think about food waste and lost. And so one of the big things we try to do is, I think, bring up in the consumer's mind and educate that this even exists to begin with. Really interestingly, when we go and we talk to our potential partners, whenever we talk about food waste, it's always kind of this, if you're in the industry, you go, oh yeah, I know, I hate doing that. I hate throwing that food away. And so I think really shining light on this topic and changing kind of our modern standard of just saying like, oh, well, that food gets thrown away at the end of the day and, so be it. Let's regenerate the way that we think about that food and really appreciate its value.
Great. I have a little bit of background noise, so let me know if it gets too distracting. There are some sirens going by. But I'd like to talk a little bit about, and Maddie, you touched on this a bit, I think, talking about farming and agricultural infrastructure and how, a lot of smaller farmers who are growing things regeneratively don't have as much of an institutional outlet for their goods because they're growing things at, a 50 metric ton scale instead of a 500 or 5,000 metric ton scale. And so something that I've been really interested in recently is sort of farming hubs and rebuilding infrastructure and kind of rethinking the way that institutional and large corporate buyers can help aggregate that supply. So I wonder if either of you have any thoughts about kind of the role that private companies can or should play in kind of rebuilding some of that infrastructure. And either one of you can hop in if you have thoughts. It's kind of a curveball too. So if you don't, it's okay. We can move on to the next. It's just something that I was kind of, I wonder.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the Too Good To Go side, I think that, corporations, let's say in general, play a massive role in the food waste spectrum. So something that we do, we haven't really started doing yet in the US, but we do in the 16 other countries where we operate, is we work with, everyone from local cafeterias. So, let's say even at a workplace, when we were all going to work 5 days a week, and there would be a corporate lunch, for example, that, everyone eats 20 sandwiches and there's 90 of them there. What happens to the rest? All the way up through working with folks like Dannon to, when they have food loss that happens at the manufacturing level, to really bring light to that and to say like, hey, there are 1,000 yogurt cups that are actually about to be thrown away, how can we bring people there to come pick up that great food? I think that the quantities just get larger and larger as you go to the corporate scale versus the individual scale.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to talk about this. I think it's just a great question, Leah, just around like infrastructure and sort of co-op building. I mean, from a farming side and us working with a lot of suppliers, similar to how, Claire's talking about just the scale and changing at different levels, like co-op building is sort of natural into the farming world of sort of one name buying from 100 or 200 farms in the region just to sort of aggregate product and make it easier to sell. It sort of then aggregates the size and scale of loss or waste, or sort of the changes between, these carrots are only 9 inches long and these are 12 inches long. What do we do? And for Imperfect, we say, let's buy them all. But I think sort of aggregating or taking that natural concept of co-op building or food hub building back into sort of the food waste world is also really helpful, because how can we aggregate the problems to make it easier to solve? Right, if it was only in one place, we would have solved it really easily. But I think that finding ways for companies and organizations to sort of build this back together, in the US, I know New York State is building a regional food hub in and around New York City and the Bronx, and sort of some of these states and cities are actually coming together to realize this is going to be a solution. Rhode Island has just built a really large food hub as well. And so I think this idea is sort of coming back, and again, not a new idea, we're just sort of resurfacing it, and it's helping to solve some of these infrastructure challenges, or at least aggregating the problem together so we can solve it quicker.
That's amazing. And to be candid, I did write my thesis on that New York City food hub. So that was kind of where that question was coming from. And I feel like all roads always lead back to food hubs for me. So thank you for indulging me that question. I really enjoyed hearing your thoughts on it. You're both in sort of the B2C market. And I think it seems to me that the B2C market for excess or imperfect food has had more success as an outlet for those items. What needs to happen, do you think, to have wider adoption on an institutional level or on a more like large corporate level?
I'm unmuted, so I guess I can go first.
Okay.
I think it is happening. I think the B2C world, like both Too Good to Go and Imperfect, just have the capacity to reach customers and consumers, and it's super sexy. And so people are talking about it, but I think it is happening behind the scenes in the institutional world in a way that's really magnificent. So even a brand we carry is Matriarch Foods. We carry their broth in a couple of our markets, and Anna, who runs Matriarch Foods, it's actually an upcycled vegetable broth, and they sell it in sort of a concentrate form. And she's actually selling it to large institutions. So think like cafeterias and anyone that's cooking for, college, universities, et cetera. And I think that finding ways to reach customers and consumers is actually building that educational platform, where I think, Claire and the Imperfect team have just done such a good job of telling the story of why we need to pivot all of our thinking to be a little different as customers and consumers. Like, how can we think differently about, bread that was made 5 hours ago as opposed to 20 minutes ago? How do we think differently about, twisty carrots versus, conventionally straight carrots? And I think that consumer education has just been monumental to grow the movement. When we started doing this in 2015, people looked at us like we were crazy, talking about imperfect, carrots and onions and potatoes and apples. And now sort of ugly produce or imperfect produce is sort of commonplace. And that's an incredible feat, that like people really understand this and they're not as scared of this, wild wonky concept, and they sort of embrace the wonky. And I think that has been the power of the B2C movement. And I think that the institutional side, it's happening, it's just not as known. And I, feel pretty proud and excited about, the upcycled foods movement and what they are doing, and what they're doing on the institutional side, what universities are doing around sort of changing their procurement practices, And so I think it's coming. I think it's happening. It's just what we hear about are some of the B2C companies, and that's not a bad thing either.
Totally.
Yeah, I would totally echo what Maddie said, actually. I think it's so true that the B2C movements, because, they're focused on consumers, which is a much larger audience, just get more of the story out there. And I do think it is the tip of the spear in terms of education. I love what Maddie was saying. I so agree, because if we as, everyone's a consumer, right? So like if we as everyone in the US population thinks differently about our food, the value of our food, what our food needs to look like, then I think we can make larger impacts across really every sector. I do think there are some really interesting folks who are operating in the B2B space. So, there's a startup, spoiler alert, that actually just got some funding. They have a great team, I believe out of Boston, doing some really interesting things to be able to try and reduce food waste at the institutional level. And then I think, another company that's in our space, Appeal, they're both B2C and kind of B2B as well. I think they're doing a great job when it comes to, for example, with supermarkets who, have some of the largest amounts of waste, because they handle some of the largest amounts of food, they're actually coming up with a way to track, how long that food is good for, and to be able to actually manage. I think back to Maddie's example of planning your fridge, they're sort of doing that at an institutional level. And I think it's really inspiring, I really feel like we need more innovation in this space. And we need as many folks to enter as possible in order to really be able to make an impact on this issue that's so large. I think probably everyone who's here today knows that, 8 to 10% of greenhouse gas emissions actually comes from food loss or waste. So if it were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases after the US and China. And when you have a problem that's that large, I think there needs to be a lot of innovation from a lot of different angles to really start solving it. So yeah, I think at the end of the day, I'm in a very similar camp to Maddie. Any education we can get out there, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from my perspective, it's easy to forget that like these companies and these institutions are made up of people who are also consumers, right? And so like these B2C companies who are so appealing to consumers, they take that with them into their workplace, and are able to then advocate for the stuff that they're really interested and passionate about. So that's something that makes me really hopeful. And Claire, you were talking a little bit about innovation. I'd love to hear from both of you, just what's one of your favorite and sort of most creative ways that you've seen food waste mitigation implemented. So like, for example, I really love the MIT food cam, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but essentially there were all these leftovers constantly from meetings and conferences at MIT that were getting left out, but then ultimately wasted. So they set up, because they're, nerdy tech MIT people, they set up a camera where you could hit a button, set your leftovers down, and then it would send out an alert and tweet and on Slack to let everyone know, hey, there are these leftovers in the break room, come and get it. So does anything come to mind for you guys about kind of cool, creative ways that people have mitigated food waste? You both look thoughtful, but I can call on someone.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm of the believer that like, I love the simple ideas that you're like, of course, like this is not that crazy. I'm going to go back to like, I love Pyrex. Like I love sort of glass Tupperware that you can see what's inside. And so you're sort of more inclined to consume. I think some of the ideas, Replate is a great organization. They're sort of based in the California West Coast region, but they work with some of the largest cafeterias or sort of workplaces. So, think of Slack or think of Google's Office, and they'll take all of the leftovers from, the cafeteria, from meetings, and sort of redistribute that to different nonprofits. And so it's very similar to sort of the food runners of the MIT, but how do you think about this at a larger scale in a way where you can sort of aggregate resources? So I think they did a really incredible job. I think the Pyrex at home, but yeah, if it was that easy, to have solved this, sort of, it would be done, but it takes all of these complex and sort of really creative ideas across the board at every stage of the supply chain. So I'm here for all of them.
Yeah, I think for me, actually, the like upcycled food, Maddie was mentioning one of the, stock broth companies earlier. I just love those ideas. I think maybe it's like the home cook in me too. I just think it's really, really cool to be able to take something that would have otherwise been wasted and kind of give it like a classic, let's say makeover where everyone can now appreciate it and see how gorgeous it is. So yeah, I love all the innovation. It's really actually hard for me to choose. I feel like Too Good to Go is still so new too, that for me, I'm like, being like a home-based player, I'm like, I think that's actually kind of breakthrough as well.
Awesome. So Maddie, you touched a little bit on kind of reallocating excess food. I wonder if Too Good to Go, Claire, had to navigate any challenges, whether it was like regulatory or just logistical. I mean, I'm sure lots of logistical, but in taking uneaten food and that is like perfectly good, but then, being able to reallocate it essentially. Because I know when I was a teenager and I was working at Starbucks, there would be all these leftover pastries at the end of the day, but we were not allowed legally to take them to a food bank or, donate them. They had to be just thrown away. And so I wonder if you could shed some light on whether there's been like any regulatory change that's made it a little bit easier to navigate that, or if you guys have had to get creative. Yeah.
Yeah, I love this question. And actually, Leah, I also worked at Starbucks as a teenager, and I know exactly what you're talking about. I would say, we're still really new at Too Good to Go. And we're still in the kind of the heat of, I think, the battle to be able to get consumers, and I think also really large businesses, to think differently about that food waste. So I would say our biggest challenge is not necessarily regulatory. The way that we work with our partners, consumers go and they pick up that food in a surprise bag, just like they would, go and pick up a sandwich at midday. And so for us, I think it's really sort of jumping over the hurdle in the US mentality. And, I think we're actually more mature in some of our European markets where it's just like, it's an absolute no-brainer, it's a foregone conclusion. But I think in the US, we're still up against, kind of the stigma, I think, of, okay, what is surplus food? Is that still good to eat? Is this, just as good as other food? I think that's really our biggest barrier.
Great, thank you. We have a wonderful question in the chat that I'd like to share from Laura. They'd like to know, I'm sorry, Lauren. They'd like to know how you manage your sourcing and what has been the most challenging about building relationships with different excess or imperfect food sources. Maddie, do you want to take this one first?
Sure, happy to. I'm going to give a shout out to my incredible sourcing team. So we have an incredible team both on the produce side and sort of in the CPG or grocery world. And they basically go out and build a network of different suppliers and retailers and grocers. Sorry, not grocers, retailers and growers. And basically we'll go out and make sure that we're the right fit. So basically talk to different, growers and ranchers and say, here's what we do. Does this make sense? Do you have product that you're actually not able to bring to market because of sort of cosmetic visual cues that are completely arbitrary? And if they say yes, then we'll bring them into our network. And so it's really about a partnership. So we'll never, if a grower already has the capacity to sell 100% of what they grow, that's incredible. And that's amazing. And, they're good. We're not going to force anyone into our network, but most growers don't have that. And so we basically go out and make sure that it's the right fit for them and us, and then we'll bring them into our network. And then each week, they'll tell us what they have available. We really are sort of working on the seasons and what's going on in the ground, in the soil, on the trees. So our team does an incredible job sort of finding the right fit of growers across the board, across the country. And it's not easy, right? It's a hard ecosystem. It's a hard sort of landscape to make sure that we can fit logistically and make sure that we can save as much food as possible. But we really do follow the waste, is what we like to say internally. So we'll go where we find crops and where we find regions where there's need for someone like us, and excited to sort of continue to grow in that way. I hope that answers your question, Lauren.
And then I can go from the Too Good to Go side. So I would say when we build relationships with our partners, so we have about 8,000 partners now in the US that we work with across our 12 cities. And, some are large, some are smaller operations, some have a ton of food waste, some have, very, very little. And I would say the biggest challenge actually has been we operate a model where we try to be a win-win-win. So, as a B Corp, balancing profit and impact, we try to make sure, the planet wins. Every surprise bag you pick up is the CO2 equivalent to charging a smartphone 422 times, if you can believe it. So every bit counts. Consumers get great food for a third of the price. And then the partners that we work with typically see new consumers come in the door, and they also get some increased revenue. So it's really our goal is to make sure that everyone is having a positive impact out of the experience. But I think, again, it's a new concept, and I think there's always a sort of change cost there. And so for our partners, our goal is to make it as easy as, rather than throwing that food away, let's use that Starbucks example that we're both so familiar with, just putting it into a surprise bag and handing it off to a consumer. We know with the partners that we work with, once we're integrated, it is that easy. And anything we can do to make their lives easier, we do. But I think it's really getting over the challenge of being able to, implement something new, roll it out. I think businesses are more strapped than they've ever been. And so, I think just being able to get that education out there and help them understand that this is only going to positively impact you. I think that's really kind of, I think it's just new thinking, but I think we'll get there.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel very hopeful, and especially like having this conversation with you two and the kind of community of people that join these calls and kind of in the innovation series in general, I always walk away from it feeling like, okay, we have like really smart, compassionate people who are working on these problems. So yeah, it makes me feel a little better walking around in the world. So there's one question I'd like to address to both of you from Connie, who is curious to hear how you both think about the role of labor in field food waste, and if you see so that's sort of on Maddie's side, I think, and then if you see the consumer pull for better labor practices, however you define that. And I think that's something maybe Claire, you can speak to. I don't know if that's something that you're seeing reflected in kind of your consumer findings. Yeah,
I'm going to try to answer this as best as possible because we could spend 2 hours at minimum on this alone. The fair price of food is something we're all advocating towards, right? And so similar to how Claire thinks about a win-win-win across sort of each bag they sell, for us, every amount of imperfect produce that we can buy from a farmer, whether it's a fruit, veg, whatever the commodity is, we want to make sure that we're giving revenue back to that farmer that would have been lost, right? If you leave it in the ground, if you have to compost it, till it under, you don't get the return on that you've already spent on. And the labor is piece of it, right? So we're paying a fair price for that product to make sure that we're giving back to that grower and seeing in return on that for them. It is a really tricky, challenging business, the entire agricultural industry. And so the hope and desire of what we're doing is really around how can we give back to that grower and make sure that they're seeing all of their resources that were put in, both time, energy, labor, and money, into the soil come back to them. And that's what we're chasing. And that's how we have all of these growers sort of on our side and supporting us, from the beginning, because they see that too. And that's what we're hoping to sort of continue to generate and continue to grow.
Thank you.
And I would say from our side, we all get into this business because we love food, and if you talk to your local, baker, pizza shop, whoever it may be, they do what they do out of passion, first and foremost. And so from our standpoint, we've heard from so many of our partners who are, the day-to-day folks running that operation, that they're just really happy they don't have to throw away that food anymore, that they've put so much energy into. And on top of that, they do, the businesses themselves do always make additional revenue off of the surprise bag themselves. So the goal there is that at least covers the cost of that food and the ingredients and the time that goes into it, if not a little bit more. I'd say that's the way that we probably most impact labor practices, especially, within small independent businesses in the US.
Awesome. Thank you. We have a couple of great questions in the chat. I'd like to ask first one of my own questions, which is how the pandemic affected the production of and the market for these excess and imperfect foods, and what lessons did you personally take away, or did your organizations take away from whatever challenges or opportunities that presented?
Yeah, I would imagine we both have pretty robust answers for this one. Really interestingly, actually, we were scheduled to launch Too Good To Go in the US in March 2020. If you can imagine, that did not happen, for a number of reasons. And we were sort of watching and looking as through the early pandemic, especially, supply chains were getting disrupted and we were seeing more food waste than ever. And it's just really sort of heartbreaking. And so actually what we did was we sort of, we watched, we listened, and then actually quite quickly in July 2020, we turned around and said, you know what, we have to launch this thing. We can't wait any longer. We need to get this solution in the hands of, US consumers and businesses. And so even during the pandemic, we actually kind of, we launched in New York City at the end of September 2020, followed very quickly by Boston, followed very quickly by many other cities. And, it's been such an unusual time, I think, to operate and to start something new, but we're really such a passionate group of people behind this mission. And we really felt like we just can't wait. This issue isn't waiting and the climate isn't waiting. So, we have to kind of make this happen regardless.
March 2020. Yeah, I think the thing that, we've seen that I think all of us could probably share in some degree is there was sort of a lot going on in the last couple of years, but one, it was like there was a period of empty shelves when we can all recall sort of going back to the grocery stores and you couldn't get anything. There was the period of high, so many covers of different newspapers and, different newsletters, if you're on them, of just growers, farmers dumping product, whether it was milk being thrown out, whether it was whole farms of zucchini. And at the same time, it was all just showing something's wrong. Our system is broken. There's food that can't get to people and shelves are empty. And everyone's looking for food. That demand wasn't going down. And so I think it really sort of solidified for me and for Imperfect as a concept, so our system is not working. And these conventional supply chains, we need to be more creative and innovative, and we need to figure out ways to rethink this so that we can be more nimble. And I think the nimble sort of quick pivoting wasn't happening in the beginning. And you've seen where we are now, which is, in a very different state, but it really sort of solidified to Imperfect that there's a reason to exist and there's a reason to sort of save more food. we've done everything from bring in movie theater popcorn when movie theaters shut down, to rescue large quantities of different tuna and different fish that was actually headed to cruise ships. It was actually already caught and processed for cruise ships. A lot of pre-cut veggies that were going to institutions, universities, and cafeterias and such. So just there was, food is moving and planted years in advance. And the fact that we're still saving food that was maybe planted or grown in 2019 or 2020 for different outlets, and the world looks different. We need to be able to rethink the food system and our supply chains quickly. And we're not the only ones. And I'm grateful for everyone that's sort of helping to rethink and reshape and reshift how food moves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you've both touched a little bit on some statistics about what the impact that both of your organizations have made. How Good works with Chipotle to put together their real food print so that consumers on the app can just see, by ordering this burrito, you've saved this much water and you've improved soil biodiversity on this many, however many hectares of land. So I'd love to hear how you guys kind of communicate the impact that consumers have had by using your services, and just kind of give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about it, because I am interested to hear more. Claire, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah. So as you can probably tell by what I was talking about with one surprise bag, equating to the CO2 of charging your smartphone 422 times. We really do measure everything in CO2 equivalency just to give us at least, a starting benchmark on the impact that each consumer is having and each business is having. I think interestingly with the issue of food waste, there is so much more than just the CO2. So actually globally, 25% of fresh water is used to grow food that's never even eaten. And so, there are all these unseen consequences, I think, behind food waste, but CO2 is really the one that we found that we use as kind of our standard benchmark, because I think it adds up quite quickly. So, I mentioned that we've only been in the US for about 18 months. And actually we have about 2 million people in the app. And that community has already saved almost 1.7 million meals, which is the CO2 equivalent of over 800 flights around the world, which is kind of mind blowing. And we really feel like that's just the beginning. So, I think there's a lot of ways to look at this problem. And if we can even at least start to use one yardstick, I think it gets us there. I would love, and I'm sure Maddie feels similarly, I would love a more kind of robust way to look at it. But I think that requires us to be further along as a sort of holistic society to think about food and the broader impacts.
Yeah, I think Claire and I take a similar approach of, we measure as a community of imperfectionists how much food we've saved, but we actually give every customer on your account page sort of an average of how much food you've saved from lesser outcome, as well as the avoided gallons of water and CO2 that goes into growing and wasting that food that you've saved. So it gives you both the amount of food you saved as well as the water you've avoided and the CO2 you avoided. And collectively, we've saved over 163 million pounds of food, which is about 44,000 tons of CO2 and over 4 billion gallons of water. It just becomes such a massive number that you're sort of like, how do I even quantify that? Like, I can't even visualize 4 billion gallons of water that would have gone into growing the food that we've saved. And so it becomes really large, but we do try to give each customer sort of this bite-sized impact, and just to celebrate like every shop you've made, what you're doing, because it's sort of, we bring you in on this journey of help us save food. Like, you're the one that gets to do it. We're just the node, we're the marketplace, but the customer really is the one that's able to add the apples to their cart, add the potatoes, add pretzels, add pasta. And we want to make sure we're celebrating the wins of what you're doing. It's just, as Claire said it really well, it really is a hidden problem. And sometimes it's hard to quantify sort of visually, mentally, intellectually, the amount of water or carbon, because how do you even, hold carbon? But it's a massive feat. and to be able to sort of build a community of people that can collectively celebrate their individual wins and then the collective wins, I think is something that we celebrate every day, because, you know, that takes a lot of customers to get to 163 million pounds of food. You know, and that's on each individual shop. So we're really grateful for all of our sort of imperfectionists that have joined along the way.
I love that. And the idea of, you know, celebrating wins is so important to make the customer and consumer feel included and like part of a larger mission. But I think that, you know, contextualizing, as you both said, carbon is really tough, right? Like it's not something that a lot of people can just think, oh, that's, you know, 1 kilogram of CO2 equivalent. And so getting creative to kind of help people understand. And that's something I think we're just going to see more and more of as carbon labeling becomes more common, you know, to hopefully get creative to kind of, you know, bring consumers along on that journey. Okay, so we are actually getting close to end of our time, which I am shocked. I also just got a Too Good To Go notification on my phone. I don't know if you guys can see. So I don't know if they can tell we're together or what's going on. So my phone is listening to me, but
we follow GDPR, so there's no way. Just good timing.
Okay, good. So I think we have time for one more question, and I think it's a kind of a big question. But essentially, I would love to hear from you both kind of some other upstream strategies for reducing food waste in the system. So like, is it even possible in a society that's so focused on abundance and identical customer experience? Like, obviously we keep coming back to the same point, which is that this is such a systemic issue. So basically I'm asking you, you know, what would put you out of business? But what, you know, I don't think that you're giving away any sort of like organizational or company secrets here, because it is such a big and systemic problem. But yeah, essentially to reiterate, like upstream strategies that you could see helping to reduce food waste, and you can make it specific to the US if that would make it easier.
Okay, big question. So this answer is just not even going to be close to sufficient, but I'm going to try. I mean, the two things that, and these are not new, we've talked about this in the last hour, it's like diversifying the supply chain so that like farmers, producers, ranchers have many outlets. That's really core, and that's sort of why Imperfect exists, but making sure that like that upstream source has many places for their food to go. And then great forecasting, right? This is the one that's obviously the biggest challenge, and why there's so many incredible players out there, whether it's, you know, as Claire mentioned, spoiler alert, or sort of A-Fresh, or some of these other companies coming in trying to innovate and provide nuance there. If we had a perfect forecast, you know, at all points of the system, this would be a different challenge. And then I think sort of on the consumer side, normalizing selling out, like we just have to get, you know, more okay with less bountiful shelves. It's a little bit of the power of e-commerce, is you don't have to have full bountiful shelves that a customer doesn't know. And then also normalize imperfections, right? Like normalize the scars, normalize the bumps, normalize the odd shapes and sizes, because those are the things that are inherently creating food waste because we don't like the visuals. So hopefully adds a little bit of the sliding scale of options there.
Awesome.
Yeah, I have to say, I love normalizing selling out. I think that that's a massive one. You know, when we think about how we got to this place today, and, you know, if you think about the massive increase in food waste that we've seen since, let's say, even the 1960s, so much of it has to do with our expectations as consumers, and I think obviously desire as businesses to be able to meet or exceed those expectations of, you know, when you go to a supermarket, you see that perfect kind of like lineup of rotisserie chickens or baguettes or baked goods or whatever it is. And I think starting to really value what it takes to get that food there, all the way from, you know, the grain that's ground to make the bread through to someone actually producing it. and then saying like, yeah, things sell out and that's okay. That's totally normal and it's totally okay. So yeah, I mean, from my standpoint, at Too Good to Go, I would love if we didn't have a reason to exist, if you know what I mean. We sort of come after the fact that those fully stocked shelves of, you know, those perfectly made items haven't all been sold. And so you get the same thing, you know, in your surprise bag that you'd get 15 minutes before closing, but just no one purchased it. So yeah, I mean, I really think education first and foremost, and then I would absolutely echo the solutions Maddie brought up. Forecasting is a massive one there.
Wow, thank you so much, both of you. We're out of time. Thank you for reiterating those points. I think that those are some great takeaways for people who are either going into their, you know, everyday life as a consumer, someone who works in the food system, someone who works on a procurement team. I think that you guys have provided such insight and great strategies for kind of moving forward. I want to say thank you to the audience for joining us today and being part of this learning community and kind of knowledge sharing that we've established over the last couple of years. Definitely go check out Too Good to Go and Imperfect Foods. They're both great. I'm subscribers of both, so I am biased, but I think they're wonderful. And yeah, please sign up for our next innovation series. It's going to be great. It's on April 14th, so we've got a few weeks off. And yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for having us. Take care.
Thanks, Leah.